Hello and welcome to another Blender know-how tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to jump right into Blender 2.8 as in the last tutorial we talked about and installed Blender 2.8 along with some of the things that you should know about it while getting in. So go ahead and click on to Blender. Click off of this pop-up just to get rid of it. We're not going to use it. If it's your first time using it, sometimes it will ask if you want to use the right click or left click. Just use the defaults and then continue on. Now that we are in Blender, there's a lot of things that you might be confused by, and I hope to be able to clear up some of this confusion. Let's start at the top and go through some of these things. So up here, just like in most programs, these are your edit menu, your file, edit, all your different menus. And you can go through and just like other programs file, there's like the save and open and new and those types of things. Some of these we will learn as we go. Render is going to be an important one later. This is how we're going to render images and videos. Let's jump over to here. These are actually fairly new to Blender 2.8. Blender 2.79 had a similar feature, but this is way better in a user interface standard. These you can click on and it will change your entire environment to what it probably would look like if you were wanting to do one of these types of animation concepts. If you want to UV edit and work with textures, you can just click on the UV editing tab and voila, Blender is now a UV editing software. It almost converts the entire software into another type of environment. I generally use the layout for most of the things, and I work in here because this is how Blender has looked for a long time, so it's mainly just the way that I've gotten used to it. But feel free to use modeling, to sculpt. These are all really nice. At the left, let's go over here. These are the tools that you will use while working in the viewport. Everything that you do within here can either have a hotkey or it will be one of these buttons mainly. It doesn't look like there's a lot over here, but that will change. These change as you go into different modes. Like for instance, sculpting. You can see there's all the different sculpting brushes that you can use, and that's nice. It's all right there, and they change as you go into each one of these, or if you change it while you're within this tab. Another thing that you should look at is this right here. A lot of these things you will learn as you go, but this is probably an important one to pick up right now. And this is the idea that you're in an object mode right now. That whatever you're working on, it's an object. You can't edit it, like in this mode at least. You can't edit the object other than moving it, or scaling it, or rotating it. So if you have a cube, it's a cube. And that's it. If you're in edit mode, this is the mode that you would use to actually change objects, the shape. So those are the main two things that you will probably use while you're in Blender. Although sculpting is obviously for sculpting and it will modify the shape of the object that you're working with. And all these other things you can paint on your objects. You can use Blender to draw textures. So let's just go back to object mode for right now as we go over more of the overview of Blender. Let's actually go right here. These are different shading or methods to view the viewport or the objects in your viewport. For instance, let's say click on this one, it will go to the wireframe and you can see through your objects, which is nice. It's very convenient if you have objects layered, you can position them sometimes easier when you can see through them. So that's good to know. This is just a solid, this is the standard one. You'll probably be in this one for a lot of the time if you want to see what your environment is looking like or what your objects are looking like. This is kind of new. This is the look dev mode, and as far as I know, this will give some new ways of looking at objects. We'll provide some shading options, and will make the objects easier to view. And this one right here is the rendered view. And this is actually what your object will look like, or at least a close approximation of what it will look like when you render the image or the video, besides all the grids and these lines. If you want to go back to the look dev mode, I forgot to show you that you can actually change the way some of these things look by going into the shading tab. So mainly the look dev is just supposed to give you some more ways of looking at the same object in a different way to see what it looks like in different environments. Let's jump over there right now. These are collections, or this is like the scene viewer, the outliner. In a lot of programs they have something very similar to this. I know Maya uses this, Cinema 4D uses this, most 3D softwares will use this. In fact, even softwares such as like Photoshop, if you're familiar, use layers. These are similar to layers, only these are objects, where you can actually click on the objects and it will select it over here in the viewport, as well as these collections, or another way to think about this is just a group. And you can group objects and they will show up here. It's kind of nice to be able to see the organization of your scene. Down here, you'll be working a ton down here. I feel like this is, if we jump through all these different tabs, this one right here, this is like your main one that you want to go to right before you render something. You can change which render engine you'll be rendering with. Eevee is the default, and it works great. That's the fastest one that's for Blender right now. Cycles is probably the best looking one. That's kind of debatable between Eevee and Cycles, but yeah, those two you'll probably use often, and all these different options within it. And as you go through here, there are different tabs for different things that you'll be doing. For instance, right here, this wrench looking one is a common one. This is the modifier tab, and you can click on it, and there's a ton of things that you can do to your object to be more productive, such as a very common one in Blender is the subdivision surface, which pretty much smooths your object. That's the main goal of it. And there's many others like the mirror, the wireframe. And as you go on, this is another common one that you will probably use often. It is the material tab, and this is where you create what your object looks like. And we can even look at it in the rendered view, or we can just look at it in normal view. Next is the texture tab, and this one is for textures. So similar to the material is generally you can put textures on your materials. Textures are images, whereas materials are the way your overall object will look. For instance, let's look at like how metallic it is, how shiny it is. That's kind of like what specular is, how rough it is, how all these different options. IOR is for reflectivity. You can make it look like water. You can make it look like goo. And as you go down these, there's more. We can go look at the other tabs, such as the particles tab and the physics tab. And this can be used for physics within Blender. The last thing that we want to look at is the timeline at the bottom. This is mainly this is for animation. You can keyframe and make objects move according to this timeline as it plays back. A couple other things just to note that if I haven't talked about it, to click and to navigate in Blender is the left click button. So you can click off objects and click on them using the left click, which is a great enhancement from what it has been in the past, as it was a right click. And if you right click, it will bring up a menu for common things that you would want to do to your objects. You can also, for keyboard shortcuts, you can hit tab to go into edit mode. which is the same thing as going up here to edit mode. And now we can edit our objects. To move them, like I just did, hit G, and you can move it with your mouse. To select everything, hit A, and to rotate, you hit R. To scale, you hit S. And if you, just like I have been doing, if you do not want to actually like leave it at that size, you can always right click in the middle of your, like if you're dragging out to scale it up and you're like, I want it back to the same exact size, you can always right click and it'll put it back to the normal size. Or you can always click and undo it using Control Z. So these are some basic navigation help around Blender. If you want to orbit around something, you hold down the middle mouse button and drag. If you want to zoom in, just scroll in with your scroll bar and zoom out with it. And if you would like to pan, hit Shift and middle mouse click and drag. So these are kind of the basic navigation things that you'll be using often, as well as the numpad. Like I said in the last video, the numpad will be very helpful. And you'll get used to all these different shortcuts, but 1 will go to the front face, 7 will go to the top, and 3 will go to the right. 5 will turn it into either, it's a toggle, so it'll turn it either perspective or orthographic, meaning it will either make your scene look flat or it will make it look 3D. Orthographic is much like a blueprint, like a house blueprint where it's flat and you don't see perspective, whereas the perspective is obviously where there's leading lines that go into a horizon and so forth. And the 4, 6, 8, and 2 keys are to navigate in the direction as many times you press of whatever direction. So like 2 would be down, 8 would be up, 4 would be left, 6 would be right. And so yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to show for this Blender tutorial. I hope it has helped a little bit to get a little bit used to it. Jump into Blender, immerse yourself in it, and it will get a lot easier. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more.